General Dynamics IT is committed to supporting the U.S. Coast Guard in advancing the nation's defense and maritime security operations and capabilities. Our innovative solutions provide the expertise, engineering, and technical excellence needed to address today's urgent homeland security priorities. For more information, visit gdit.com.
Hello, welcome to Homeland Security Today's Futurecast on Coast Guard recapitalization. I'm joined today by Patrick Forrest of American Military University. Patrick, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you do at American Military University right now?
Sure. I'm the Director of Homeland Security Programs, so I'm in charge of developing the curriculum, maintaining the faculty standards and whatnot for the undergraduate programs in Homeland Security, as well as the graduate and master's programs in Homeland Security.
Well, that sounds great. And you do know a little bit about Homeland Security because you work for the department and you've worked with the Coast Guard.
I have. I'm in the Coast Guard now as a reservist, and I worked at the department for several years in various capacities as an attorney, as a congressional liaison specialist, as just a line adjudicator doing asylum cases. So different worlds of work within the department.
Great. Understanding that you're not speaking directly for the Coast Guard as a reservist, can you tell me a little bit about your personal experiences as a reservist and maybe some of the natural disasters and emergencies that you had a first row seat for?
Well, I think one of the first things to remember is that the Coast Guard really has proven itself to do well at search and rescue. And they've done a great job saving lives in many of the most recent incidents. For example, in Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, the Coast Guard saved almost 30,000 people, rescued 30,000 people. So that first line responder job, that job as the maritime first responder for our country, they execute very, very efficiently. And during Katrina and Rita, the Coast Guard came in and was able to execute its mission because they have a lot of autonomy. And I think operationally, from a process perspective, that's why they were able to be so successful, because they have the ability to move assets without authorization, without orders, without waiting, in most instances, for a request from the governor of a state for whatnot. So the Coast Guard has that autonomy. They see a storm coming, they see a threat happening, and they go ahead and they get assets in place. And that really helps them be prepared to meet some of those challenges that occur when you are a first responder. So that's one of my big takeaways as to why the Coast Guard is successful in its overall mission, and then why it does so well with that first responder role.
Can you tell me a little bit about something, maybe an example of how you saw this bear out in some time when you were deployed with the Coast Guard?
Well, the first example that comes to mind, it wasn't when I was deployed with the Coast Guard, but was September 11th. When September 11th happened, the Commandant at the time, Admiral Allen, didn't wait to deploy assets into theater. He went ahead and did it. If we had a different authorizing structure, we would have had to wait for some prior approval, and we didn't have to do that. So then when the call came out to go ahead and get in there and do what needed to be done, the Coast Guard could do it.
Great. You know, we talked a little bit here about the Coast Guard's autonomy, but it's also important that the Coast Guard relates to the rest of the Department of Homeland Security, works very closely with FEMA, works very closely with Customs and Border Protection. Mm-hmm. Do you have any perspective on the importance of, interoperability perhaps there between the different components of the department?
Well, you brought up Katrina, and I think that was one of the great lessons learned from Katrina, was the importance of effectively engaging in interoperability and communication with our partner agencies at the federal level and our partner agencies at the state and local level. And so one of the things that the Coast Guard started doing during Katrina and has continued to do today is embed liaison officers with all of those partner entities. So what that does is it allows again, the state and local first responders, to have a single point of contact, a single Coast Guard point of contact that they can reach out to. And that person is not only, the Coast Guard subject matter expert, but if they have a hot issue, a hot question that they need a quick answer from, then they're going to be able to ask that person and rely on that person. I've been fortunate to be able to be a liaison officer in different capacities for different incidents, and it really does work well. And the Coast Guard, not only do they embed people when they're responding to an incident, but just as a standard practice now, we have people embedded in pretty much all the different agencies within the Department of Homeland Security. So you can have a line of communication at the staff level, at the operations level, and at the senior command level.
While it's great that the Coast Guard has good relationships with other agencies, it's also important that the Coast Guard have a good relationship with Congress and be able to communicate its needs to Congress. And I know you worked a little bit on this for the department when you were there. Can you tell me, how that has gone historically, and whether or not you think the Coast Guard is doing a good job or a good enough job in communicating its needs to Congress for the future?
Well, first of all, it's tough communicating the extent of the world of work the Coast Guard has, not only to Congress but to anybody. People on the evening news, they see the Coast Guard folks coming out in their helicopters, rescuing people who are stranded. So they get that. They see it in the movies as well. What they don't get as clearly is that expanded jurisdiction, that expanded role now that the Coast Guard is part of the Department of Homeland Security. That has everything to do from law enforcement to drug interdiction to damage assessment to environmental response. So that larger expanded world of work is really hard to convey because there are just so many parts of it, right? Because it's so big. Now, in regards to Congress, the Coast Guard does do a really outstanding job of talking to the members of its oversight committee. It's important to remember as well that the department has, I think at this point, almost 88 oversight committees, right? So there are a lot of members of Congress with their hands in the pot. So the department and its congressional liaisons are all constantly, all the time on the Hill, trying to explain what they're doing and get congressional support for different actions. Now, the Coast Guard has a really interesting approach. What the Coast Guard does is it embeds folks not only on the staff level with members of Congress who have an oversight capacity, so maybe the chairman or the ranking member of the Oversight Committee, but also with the committees themselves. So you've got Coast Guard personnel embedded on the staff level in Congress, and then Coast Guard personnel embedded on the actual committees in Congress. So again, going back to that concept of interoperability, we have taken the best practices from Katrina and Rita, where we said, okay, we're going to put people in our partner agencies, and we're also going to put them now within Congress. And it's worked well in that when you hear the chairperson and the ranking member of the Oversight Committee talk about the role of the Coast Guard, talk about what the Coast Guard does, they really do get it. They really do understand the extent of the mission, how difficult the mission is, the expanding jurisdiction, and they're advocating for the Coast Guard. Now, that being said, where the disconnect is happening is between the authorizers and the appropriators. So when it comes to the appropriators being actually able to get that money to the Coast Guard, it doesn't always happen. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Maybe it's a failure of the ability for them to understand, like I said, the extent of that world of work, or maybe it's just an issue of not enough revenue, not enough resources. But that's where the breakdown does seem to be happening, because you are getting the authorizers really having them in a capacity, rather, to advocate for the agency, for the service.
It's interesting that you bring that up because, what we've seen is that, Congress has said, hey, Coast Guard, we really want to protect your recapitalization funds to this level. But it seems to me the Coast Guard is having a harder time making a case saying we really could use a lot more money because we have all these failing assets that we want to replace.
And that's I think the biggest issue right now is that the average high endurance cutter I think it's now is 48 years old, right? And some of these cutters, if they're people, would be eligible for Social Security, right? So you've got Coast Guard officers, Coast Guard enlisted personnel out there on the seas saving lives in ships that were made in 1968 or older. And it's really important to have new cutters, to have these national security cutters that can go out there and have the technology in order to be their own isolated command and control center to respond to these incidents. So, one example, let's say a dirty bomb goes off in the Port of New York, right? You need to have a vessel that has the capacity to be, again, completely autonomous, be able to be its own command and control structure, and respond and lead the response to that incident. Right now, the difference between the technology in the current cutters and the technology in the national security cutters is the difference between an Atari and an Xbox. Ataris were great, but that time has passed. We need something new to meet the expanding jurisdiction and mission of the Coast Guard World War today.
Thankfully, the search and rescue need in Hurricane Sandy wasn't as bad as it was in Hurricane Katrina. But what if it had been? Could the Coast Guard have really stepped up in the same way, do you think?
I do, because, again, the Coast Guard does many things well, but whenever you listen to the Commandant speak, whenever you listen to any of the admirals speak, they'll always tell you our first job is search and rescue. Our first job is saving lives. And no matter how much you cut our budget, or no matter how much we don't get resources for what we need, we're never going to forgo that mission. And it's such a priority in the culture of the Coast Guard, and the people who are in the Coast Guard, many of them came into it because they wanted to perform that function, that I think you're always going to see them meet that capacity. Now, that being said, as we move forward in the 2013 budget process and beyond, it's very, very important that the Coast Guard continue to get the funding to keep up with its expanded mission set. One of the authorizers on the Oversight Committee said, we're at the point where the Coast Guard can't handle any more cuts. They're not cutting fat anymore, they're actually cutting bone, is what he said, and that's true. So yes, the service is always going to do that search and rescue function, but they can't keep doing more with less. At some point, something's got to give. And while the search and rescue function will be the last thing to give, that other stuff is important too. The damage assessment work, the environmental response work, all that has to continue to happen. And all of that comes in and is part of the response to an incident. The search and rescue part is just the first part. There's a lot of stuff that happens afterwards. And we saw that with Sandy. The Coast Guard did some search and rescue, but they also did oil cleanup. They also made sure that the waters were clean and the aids to navigation were working and the ports were open and the lanes of traffic were open for commerce and whatnot. And all of that has to still continue to happen.
Speaking of oil cleanup, you remind me of its response to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And it seemed to me that the Coast Guard there was struggling valiantly with other agencies and BP perhaps that were not as well prepared as the Coast Guard was. Do you have any perspective on that?
Well, I did work that response. I worked it in Mobile, Alabama, and I also worked it in the Incident Command Center in New Orleans. And the Coast Guard was there from the beginning. And I talked a little bit about the culture of the service, and I think that goes a long way, the culture of an organization. You didn't have a lot of discussion at the front end about, well, who's going to be responsible for this and who's going to pay for it from the Coast Guard's perspective. Sure, those things were talked about, but the approach was, there's an issue, there's an incident, let's get our folks down there, let's respond. So because the service has that culture, it really lends itself to effectively executing the mission. Now, after it was all said and done, then we worry about who's going to pay for what, right? Maybe under the Stafford Act or whatever it is, after litigation, then they'll worry about that. But I think the reason we were so successful in the BP oil spill is that we just said, we're not going to worry about who's responsible, we're not going to worry about who's going to pay, we're just going to get in there and we're going to do it. And I think this is important as well, we're really comfortable with Joint Command. Some agencies aren't comfortable with Joint Command. The Coast Guard is. They always have the ability, and you see it time and time again with Katrina and Rita or the BP oil spill, whatever it is, to partner with other entities and take co-leads on responding to incidents, and that's important.
So from your perspective, when we're talking about the future of the Coast Guard and recapitalizing and modernizing, what are the important takeaways? What are the things that are important to the Coast Guard going forward?
Well, first of all, obviously, we need to modernize the cutters that we have. The second thing to keep in mind is that as that world of work, as that mission set is expanding, the resources, the support that we get has to also expand if we're going to keep up with that. And the Coast Guard has been so successful as an agency within the Department of Homeland Security that they have continued to get more responsibility, which is great. And the Coast Guard keeps stepping up to the plate, but they can't keep doing more with less. And we're going to see that in the future as we move forward when it comes to the issues of the polar ice caps. Regardless of why it is happening, the paths of navigation in the Arctic are beginning to open up. And the Coast Guard, the U.S. government for that matter, doesn't really have the vessel capability to be up in the Arctic and to patrol effectively in order to defend our waterways, defend our boundaries and whatnot. So if we're thinking about short-term Coast Guard needs, more cutters, new cutters. If we're thinking about short-term to medium-term needs, we have to give the Coast Guard the proper support in order to execute that expanding jurisdiction, drug interdiction, things of that nature. If we're thinking about long-term needs, we have to think about future threats. We have to think about those worlds of work where right now they may not be impacting us. There may not be an immediate event driving a need, but there will be. So let's go ahead and do the funding right now in order to prepare the service for that. My example for that, again, would be the Arctic functions and the Arctic mission. Let's go ahead and invest in the Coast Guard now so they have the capability to be up there to do the proper patrolling.
Terrific. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Patrick.
Sure.
We do appreciate it.
Appreciate it being here.